I'm John Banther, and this is Classical Breakdown. From WETA Classical in Washington, we are your guide to classical music. In this episode, I'm joined by WETA Classical's Evan Keely, and we are talking about the life and music of living American composer ADOLPHUS HAILSTORK. This is a composer that carved his own path as musical aesthetics changed in his youth in the 1960s, and he has not wavered from his values since. We explore his life, early studies in France, his military experience, musical aesthetics, and we look at 3 of his works that you need to hear. Okay, Evan, let's get things going with another listener email on our percussion episode. It's been so nice to, read a lot of the things people have been writing in or commenting on YouTube or even Blue Sky. And this is an email from friend of the show, Tim N. Newmark, who said, "Hey, I just wanted to compliment you on the percussion episode. That was one of the most educational and fascinating episodes you've done. I never thought about the interactions between the percussion player and how they have to watch the other players to keep time with them, or the tambourine needing to be played slightly ahead of the beat. All very cool. Fun fact, in the TV series Lost, a fuselage was used in the score as a percussion instrument." Thank you so much, Tim. I'm glad you enjoyed it. And I had no idea. I mean, I never watched Lost. That was lost on me, I guess. But it was a massive phenomenon. I remember that. And I didn't know they used, part of a plane.
Yeah, I mean, I guess
sound.
you can make music with just about anything if you're creative enough. I also haven't seen the show, but maybe I should watch that scene with the someone banging on a fuselage. Sounds interesting.
Yeah, well, I'll try to include a little example. And it might not sound anything like whatever a fuselage sounds like. I mean, some of the noises in Star Wars are like, cables being plucked like like an antenna or something. But it's been so great reading what people thought about the percussion episode. But now we're here to talk about American composer ADOLPHUS HAILSTORK. And let's start with the composer's words himself, kind of where he's coming from. Why don't you read this wonderful quote for us, Evan?
I just enjoy music. I leave all the deep thinking to people who want to write books. I prefer to write music. And I'm a pragmatist. I write music to get performed. I don't write esoteric ivory tower stuff to be played by a few people in a loft for an audience of a few people. That's just not me. If I'm anything, I'm a populist. But so is Verdi. I don't mind that. Well, that's an interesting quote from ADOLPHUS HAILSTORK because as you and I have been getting more into his music for this episode, John, I'm finding that his music, yes, it does have a populist kind of a overall approach, but there's also a very sophisticated level that anyone can appreciate. So this is a composer really worth knowing.
Yes, and it's important to remember Verdi was a populist. So was Rossini. So were most of the composers that were writing this art form day in and day out because they're writing tons of things to be played, not the same thing every single month.
And it's refreshing to hear a composer say, I want to write music that people are going to want to hear.
Yeah. And he says, I leave all the deep thinking to people who want to write books. Maybe a little tongue-in-cheek there. Obviously, he is thinking deeply about some things.
Yes.
And he's a composer more well-known to people in Washington now, especially after the National Philharmonic premiered his Requiem cantata, A Knee on the Neck. That was in 2022 after the murder of George Floyd. There's no commercial recording of that, but he's become more familiar with that and some other smaller works that have been played here in the area. But we also know he's been big in education. He taught at Norfolk University for a long time, Michigan University, Youngstown State University as well. So we're going to explore his life and his music across 3 different works. But let's start at the beginning, Evan, and important to remember, this is a living composer. So a lot of the details aren't all there because this is a person that's still alive, but we know a little bit about him.
Still alive and still composing and teaching, as far as I know.
Yeah.
ADOLPHUS HAILSTORK was born in Rochester, New York on the 17th of April, 1941. He grew up in Albany, New York. And as a child and during his adolescence, he studied violin and piano and organ, also was a pretty active vocalist. He had a formative experience, it seems. As I look at interviews with him, he talks often about singing in an Episcopal church choir when he was a teenager. And he certainly writes a great deal for choirs and for the voice. And I think he's actually quite skilled as a composer for the voice, both in terms of how he's able to, set the rhythms of spoken English, American English, and also his interpretation of text. But we'll get into that, especially as we look at one of his vocal works later in the episode.
And one of the frustrating things that comes with talking about a living composer is that there's not a nice list of each work and composition year usually, especially if they're an older composer, writing before the internet. Things are spread across different publishers, so it all kind of gets compounded. But it sounds like many of his early works would have been choral, and it sounds like he really, really excelled as well at the organ. So far, it sounds like a typical composer upbringing. He's, born, obviously. He starts an instrument, he has some formative experiences, and then he goes to school. I think he starts in 1959 at Howard University, and he studies with Mark Fax, and he gets his bachelor's in music theory. They didn't have a straight composition program yet. And another quote here, we're going to read a lot of quotes from him. He said, Howard's theory program was modeled after the European model. It was frowned upon to play any gospel music in the practice rooms. Now, this is something not unique to Howard or the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, or 2000s. That is the operating practice for basically every school and conservatory I've seen or gone to
Yeah,
until very,
yeah.
very
I
recently.
think you're right,
Yeah.
John. And I'm a few years older than you, but when I was in music school in Boston University in the late '80s, early '90s, jazz and gospel and blues, like it was just absent.
Yeah, that's definitely something I experienced. At NEC, there is a big jazz department, and you hear jazz, but it's more quote unquote serious, and I would say it's more serious. You're not going to hear people practicing Glenn Miller, you know,
Mm.
or something like that. You're not going to hear that in conservatory practice rooms typically, but. That was a formative experience for him, of course, studying at Howard and with Mark Fax. And we're going to talk a little bit about how his music fits into the broader picture of what's happening in, quote unquote, American classical music in the 1960s and so on. But first, we're going to look at his Symphony Number 3, which he composed in 2002. And we're going to start this with another quote from Hailstork. In the summer of 1963, right after Howard, he studied briefly with Nadia Boulanger at the American Institute of Fontainebleau. And read us this quote, Evan.
What I took away from that class was the notion that we composers should pay careful attention to the voicing, the distribution of sound in every chord, that a C major triad is a particularly voiced C major triad. Yeah, I think that's really interesting. You and I had a conversation, I think it was last season, about Nadia Boulanger, John,
Hmm.
and the extraordinary influence that she had in 20th century music and beyond.
Yeah.
Even to this day, people who studied with somebody who studied with her, she continues to be an influence long after her death.
Yeah.
But this very simple idea of the voicing of chords, the voicing of different instrumentation and so forth, and how you spell out a C major triad.
Hmm.
This is thinking about music on a pretty deep level, and it's fascinating to listen to Hailstork's music with that quote in mind.
Yeah. Another quote on his studies with Boulanger, he said he absorbed her idea that every single juxtaposition of pitches, every single chord spacing was a unique sound that had to be appreciated for its own sake. And he said that was one of the most important lessons he learned, this distribution of sound. And that sounds like the most obvious thing. I mean, you're a composer. Yeah, your job's to pick the notes. I was thinking, like, what's another kind of almost ridiculous thing to say to someone? Like, if someone loses a race, would you say, "Why don't you just drive faster next time?"
Yeah.
Yeah, just go faster. I mean, but it's such a simple idea, but it really, really, really is one of the key points for composing, where this note is and how does it relate to something else. Okay, so with that, we hear the opening of his Symphony Number 3, and I think those points we just talked about really, really, really come through. He starts with trumpet and snare drum, and you'll notice, and if you listen to our percussion episode, you know why it sounds like that with the snares off. And from here, it grows organically, and the groove is there right from the start. Other iterations from other instruments and sections make it fugue-like, and this trumpet line, it's not a fanfare for me, but more of a call to the dance. Very similar to, I think, when I hear of Dvorak and I think Symphony Number 8, this
Right.
trumpet call to the dance.
Yes.
And again, it's so obvious. Yeah, you pick the notes, but how he has arranged all of this to flow from one thing to the next, it doesn't feel disjointed. It feels very, very organic, but not like it's just kind of oozing and sliming into the next thing as well.
And you talked about the writing being fugue-like, and I agree. There's an imitative quality. I think, strictly speaking, it's not fugal, but there's definitely this motivic unity. You hear these long phrases and different instruments, different voicings, uttering similar or the same musical material, and then it gets broken down into these smaller units, and it creates this sense of continuity. You were talking about the percussion, John, and it really seems to highlight the rhythmic drive. There's this variable meter.
Yeah.
There's ambiguity about where the beat is, which keeps it interesting, keeps you guessing where the beat's going to be. But I don't feel disoriented by that. It just gives it a drive. It sustains the interest, the energy, and there's even this in terms of the melodic writing. There's a kind of a pentatonic sound in a few places,
hmm
and these different kinds of voicings and kinds of melodic lines that, even stylistically, like it seems to be drawing, even in the first 2 minutes of this symphony, from a number of different musical traditions, and in a way that feels very authentic.
And the lines that he's bringing in, they are at the same time very contrasting from each other. There's this very fast, kind of pointillistic line, but then also a more fluid sounding line or something kind of powerful in the horn section that comes again later, and even at the very end of the symphony that comes back. After listening to this symphony and hearing his great praise for Shostakovich in an interview, I wonder if we hear that influence in the string writing sometimes. It can be very fierce
Yeah,
and very, very powerful.
yeah. I agree that there is a kind of a sense of that style creeping into this music, but still retaining its own individuality.
So we can't get into everything, of course, which with each of these movements, we have to keep going. So jumping into the second movement now, this one is really, I think, remarkable. It's similar to the first in that it grows from a small idea and then it sustains for an extended period of time. I think that's really important, how it sustains the energy. Another quote here that I think really helps paint the picture or describe what we're hearing. He says, "When it comes to harmony, I generally use triadic structures for their richness, but run the gamut from clear functional tonality to near atonality. I like most to hover in a mid-range I call nebulous or tenuous tonality, with free contrapuntal lines and varying tension chords arriving at areas centered on a note rather than in a key." Now, to unpack that a little bit, kind of going in reverse, what does it mean to focus around a note rather than a key? So, if we want to all coalesce around an A, if we're trying to maybe resolve an A minor, something very basic one might do is, okay, so I have A minor, I'm going to go from the two, I'll go from B minor to E major, and then resolve that to A minor. So you have this functional harmony. Each chord is functioning as, a stepping stone from one place to the next. But when you focus on a particular note, you're much more free to create contrapuntal lines, things that don't necessarily line up with chords that are giving tension and release in a way that is not such an up and down or vertical functional type of way.
And being on a note versus in a key is, I think, a very strong 20th century, I think particularly of Bartok as a
hmm
composer who also does that. And again, it doesn't sound atonal. You listen to this Hailstork, you really kind of wonder, like, what key are we in? And yet there's a sense of direction. There isn't a sense of just wandering in this sort of tonal desert. But there's also a sense of, kind of almost anything goes in terms of sonorities and harmonies, but they do lead to a particular pitch.
And I think Hailstork has really gone above and beyond, not to really compare or contrast, but it really feels like he has gone above and beyond than what we typically expect from American composers. And I mean this all with peace and love. This movement, it's as long as the first movement. Actually, it can be a little bit longer, and it's very, very rich, and it's very, very lush, and it's very, very sustained. And maybe this is a wild take or an assumption, but I feel like composers in the United States, we're not known for our long, slow, drawn out movements. We adopted Dvorak's Largo from the Ninth as our own. Or, we think about Barber's Adagio, but, okay, what about every slow movement by Mahler or every slow movement,
Yeah.
by Beethoven, for example, in the third that we just heard? We're not known for being able to have this long, slow, drawn out that really, really, I think, sustains the energy. Even Copland, who was able to make really beautiful, serene moments, it doesn't quite match, I think, what Hailstork is doing. I think too often it's like a means to an end. We had some really crazy atonal thing. Now we need to just kind of cleanse ourselves, and then we're going to go on to the next thing.
Yeah, and you mentioned the Adagio, the famous Barber Adagio for strings from the string quartet initially. And yeah, how long is that piece? Maybe 10, 12 minutes?
Less than that.
It's very powerful, but it's short. You think about, Bruckner's Eighth Symphony where the slow movement is half an hour. Maybe that's an extreme example, but it's hard to find American composers who have that same skill. I heard the Second Symphony of William Grant Still at the Kennedy Center, Nozeda conducting the National Symphony a season or two ago, and that was a moment where I really felt like, okay, here's an American composer who knows how to write a slow movement. So I also had that experience with this Hailstork, which, as you said, John, is the second movement. The slow movement is as long as the first movement, if not longer. And there's a kind of a hymn-like quality, too, in this writing. I'm really reminded this is someone who was an organist. This is someone who sang in church choirs. And there's these rich chords following one another in these straightforward homophonic rhythms like a hymn. And, that background really kind of comes through. And yet it doesn't have that sort of trite quality of like, oh, this is the pious part of the symphony. It really sustains an interest and has a drive even in that slow, sustained manner.
And as gently as this ends, it actually flows into the third movement. We call it a taka. That's what's written at the bottom of your page. You go straight into the next thing. It's this drone in the lower strings that kind of goes on for a little bit longer than maybe you'd expect. There's winds and xylophone. They come in before that eventually gives up. And now we have this is the shortest movement of the symphony. And it's like kind of like a scherzo.
Yeah, and like the first movement, there's that rhythmic ambiguity. We're never sure where the beat is, the variable rhythm, and once again, sustaining a sense of energy rather than just being confusing or chaotic.
And not to mention like all these other composers to talk about, just one composer. We don't like doing that, but he has talked at length in interviews about his influence of French composers like Ravel and Debussy. Obviously, he was in Paris for a bit studying. There's so many moments like this one here where it really reminds me of Ravel, the idea of combining sounds to create something a bit otherworldly, and the way he flows out of this with the snareless drum, this little ticking, sounds like an automatic watch,
Yeah.
and that just gets transformed all around the orchestra. I'm really thinking of the French influence, particularly in the voicings that I hear in this movement.
And yet there's a distinctly American sound to this as well, which I don't even know how to articulate. What do I even mean by that? And yet you feel it. That's my experience.
And then we get into the fourth movement, which opens very slow and very lyrical with these light trumpet utterances. And it reminds me of the opening of the symphony in a way, but now transformed.
Yeah, there's a cyclical quality to the way the finale harkens back to the first movement. It's not a direct quote, and yet there's a sense of we're returning to the place from which we started.
I don't have too much for this one. I think this is so great to hear in context with the first three movements. So definitely listen to this one. And if you like this one, check out his second symphony as well. I think something we hear in this is a particular American sound of like a busy groove, a kind of bass line that is just hitting the big beat. Sometimes it's just percussion or, really just downbeats with a section. And then like a swirling idea or melody over top.
And in addition to that, I'd say this is a symphony written by a composer who really knows choirs.
Mhm.
Maybe because I've sung in choirs myself over the years, I something about it. I recognize this as choral writing, even though, of course, there's no actual voices.
I agree with you fully, and I think that becomes more clear as we hear one of the choral works at the end. I think there's a lot of connections you can make.
Yes.
So let's talk real quick about what was going on in the 1960s in American classical music, and also about one of the first works that he had recognition for. So basically, in the 1960s, many composers start moving towards what we know as minimalism, especially after the likes of Terry Riley, Steve Reich, and Philip Glass in their New York scene, and also more like Laurie Anderson, who has come back into popularity because of TikTok. How does Hailstork compare to these composers? The important thing is Hailstork basically stuck to his guns, so to speak. He
Yeah.
he found what he wanted to write and his style,
Yeah.
especially going out of the choral elements, and he stuck with it.
Yeah.
And what that means is, while this rise of Riley, Reich, and of Glass, and the institutionalization and everything that goes along with that, there is just not an interest in much of the music that Hailstork is writing.
Yeah, I wonder if the extent to which a composer like Hailstork would have been perceived as quote unquote conservative.
Yeah,
And I don't think that's a label that's particularly meaningful in general. And with regard to him specifically, what would he be conserving?
right.
I don't think that he objects to minimalism or, the serialism that came before it so
Yeah.
much as he's just speaking in an authentic voice that doesn't happen to be those kinds of voices. And in the 1960s, there was a cost, I think, to that for an American composer. And of course, the challenges of being a black composer, a black man in America in the 1960s, and whether or not people are going to take such a person seriously, that adds a layer of perhaps a layer of challenges to getting his music accepted.
Yes, and as we learn, these institutions, what gets played pretty much anywhere, it's often decided by one or usually two people, a conductor and an artistic advisor.
Yeah,
And if one of them doesn't like it or who you are, then that's kind of that. We saw that directly with what Florence Price went through with Chicago Symphony,
absolutely.
or Boston Symphony, rather. So Hailstork is writing music that is more of our time and place. Reminds me of Aaron Copland, who I think he also really admired,
Yeah.
and also Bernstein, maybe more so, especially in his early days. But it's like he heard that what they were doing in the 30s and 40s, and said, I want to continue in this kind of vein, music for people, about people of our time and place.
So Hailstork is in his 20s in the 1960s. He goes to the Manhattan School of Music. He gets a BM and an MM in composition there, graduates in 1966. He's in the New York scene, literally and figuratively. He's going to hear Aaron Copland giving his lectures, and Leonard Bernstein is doing his young people's concerts and giving lectures, and of course conducting and composing. So Hailstork is immersed in that world, and you can really hear the influences on his music from those sources without their sense of being derivative.
And we can hear one of his early examples. He wrote a piece called Celebration, which was commissioned for the United States Bicentennial in 1976. And in an interview, he said this was like maybe his first big recognition, his first work played by a major orchestra. I think it was Nashville. And it's a great piece. It was recorded by Detroit, I believe, but I've not heard it live or really seen much about it since then. Other works about, us and where we are. He has An American Port of Call, which was inspired by the port of Norfolk. He wrote Armageddon for organ and percussion after September 11th. And so I really appreciate that he is doing how we should see composers in a way as historians as well, reacting to and writing music as to what is happening right now.
And I just want to remind you and our listeners, John, that you and I had a conversation in season 5 of Classical Breakdown, episode 102. We talked about music by living Black composers, and we had a
Yeah.
short conversation about An American Port of Call, which Hailstork wrote for the Virginia Symphony in 1985, and it's an orchestral piece inspired by the port of Norfolk,
Yeah.
where he was living at that time.
Now we're on to the second piece that we're going to talk a little bit more in depth on of Hailstork's. This one is his piano quintet, Detroit, which he wrote in 2018. Now, I'm maybe a little biased. I love Detroit. I used to spend several weeks a year in that city from like 2013 until the pandemic. Love the architecture, the people, and the food. I mean, it's also a very important city in the history of the development of recording technology and music, of course. And Hailstork says it was also a city that gave him many, many opportunities. And he also mentions a specific individual at the end of this, too.
Yeah, I love this piece. From the first downbeat, I'm really drawn in. Unlike you, John, I've never been to Detroit. So
Whoa.
this makes me want to go.
You've got to go. I
Yeah.
mean, there's a lot of great things and unfortunate things to see, as we'll get into. But
Yes.
he really writes something special here for Detroit. In 4 movements, we have Detroit Grit, Detroit Nocturne, Detroit Rise, and then Prayer. The opening is interesting. Sounds like some unison noodling, as if we're unveiling some complicated car engine or a factory, and then this whole thing starts to turn over, and it really starts to get moving. And there's a lot of history with Detroit. I definitely recommend reading the Wikipedia while listening to this. I definitely did that and was really surprised by some of the things with the history of Detroit. But to me, Evan, it sounds like there's a lot of small moving parts in this kind of engine of music. It's very metronomic as well, kind of like an engine. And we are charging forward with these piano downbeats that are like, no matter what, we are moving forward, we persevere.
And I think we really get a sense of Hailstork's compositional style from this 2018 piece. There's this, as we were saying with the symphony, these long melodic lines, and very often leading us to a sense of, again, they're not atonal, but we really kind of wonder what key we're in a lot of the time. And then you also have those juxtaposed with these very short melodic fragments, these almost pointillistic musical aphorisms that are kind of in call and response with these long, very complex melodic lines. But this back and forth creates a sense of dialogue. It creates a sense of tension. It's like you're listening in on a very interesting conversation, and it really keeps the energy moving.
And maybe some keen listeners will catch a glimpse of like a dies irae in the first movement. I feel like there's a moment of that foreshadows the second movement, which is Detroit Nocturne. Now, we can hear this perhaps as the city when it was hit hardest in our lifetime after the 2008 financial crisis. And I think we hear that quote coming to life, Evan. You're talking about the nebulous and tenuous tonality. With this, it feels like we are in something painful and something dark. It feels like an immense shadow has been cast over all of us and the city itself. About 2 minutes in, there's this blues line that just kind of manifests itself. And it's carrying itself very, very naturally as well. And there's more free-sounding solos that also follow this. And to me, Evan, it sounds very barren, very empty. And when I first started going to Detroit in 2013, I was taken back by these huge, beautiful old buildings. The architecture is splendid, but they're empty or they're boarded up. Or you're driving and you stop at a stop sign and you look to your right. It would be a totally normal neighborhood, but it's completely abandoned.
Yeah.
Like dozens of houses. Like it's just very, very eerie. I didn't live there, of course, but it felt like it was too quiet. It was too quiet of a city. Something had left. I mean, if you think about, you've never been there, but they have this avenue called Woodward, which is massive. It's super wide. People walk across it freely because it's not a busy boulevard, or it wasn't when I was there.
And this particular passage seems to me like another very choral kind of moment.
Yeah.
I don't know that describing this passage as cantabile is really the best way to describe it. And yes, and yet there's a singing quality. And there's often a sense of a solo voice singing and the rest of the choir responding and or accompanying in this particular writing. And I don't know if it's sadness and desolation I hear in this movement. I think yes, and there's a kind of mysterious quality. There's an uncertainty, sorrow, but perhaps also a calm. There's something alluring about it as well as something sorrowful.
Yeah, it sounds like maybe like a nocturne, like all nights. This is temporary. The sun will one day rise again. And that kind of brings us to the third movement, Detroit Rise, which opens very slow, very droning, kind of just flows from the previous movement, and then it suddenly picks up.
Yeah.
And while it's also very uplifting, very joyful, I think it still retains some of the ideas of the nocturne. These downbeats no longer feel like we're trudging and heavy, just trying to get through the night. Now our feet are lighter. For me, Evan, this movement has something in particular that, thank goodness, Hailstork does very, very well, and it points back to what I think we learned with the Boulanger quotes about being so exact in the voicing and really, really thinking critically about it. A walking bass is included, and it's not a cringe fest. And I'm sorry, but this is so often a badly used trope in American music. It barely even reflects what it's supposedly referencing. It's like you took a square and you made it more square. We need to send you to a university. You must be studied. But
Yeah.
the way Hailstork is getting into it is a little bit different. Maybe it's because of the harmony. He's not looking for functional harmony, trying to shove in rhythm changes. So we go to this chord, and then boom, ba-doom, 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 ba-doom. It's not that. There's much more, I think, and not to say intellectual, but there's something much more happening here that is, it works.
Yeah, there's an authenticity about it. It's like someone who's fluent in the language. It's so easy for that, like you said, cringe fest, I think is a good way to describe these kinds of things, which could be very trite and pedestrian in the hands of a lesser composer or arranger, but not here. One of the things I appreciate about Hailstork is how he's able to reference old and familiar things in a clear way while still saying something that's both new and something that's distinctive. It's his voice, and it avoids that contrived manner that would be very easy for a lesser composer to fall into.
And it's not even a matter of you have to grow up in jazz or know this. It is literally just following the ideas that Boulanger talked about. Of course, you do need to know a bit of the language and where all this is coming from, but it's the critical thought, I think, that goes into it. Because there's other composers, European composers, that also write very well in this kind of jazz or blues sound. And then it ends abruptly. And maybe we can just easily conclude this is Detroit's Rise unfinished. It continues.
The ending, this non-ending, it's kind of a shock.
Mm-hmm.
It may be, as you said, reminding us the story of Detroit is far from finished.
And then the final movement, Prayer. This is what wraps everything together beautifully. This was dedicated to the memory of Brazil Dennard, an influential choral director in Detroit who passed in 2010 and was someone important for Hailstork. After some gentle noodling, it feels like we are suddenly at the end of a wonderful service. It sounds like we are at the end of a funeral, at the end of a celebration, going to a celebration. And that's what I think is so important about Hailstork's music. He's writing of our time and place. He's telling a story that we know of Detroit, that we've seen, with our own eyes what's happened. But he's also including people, a person too, as if to say, hey, I can't talk to you all about Detroit without mentioning Brazil Dennard. This is one of the most beautiful movements. And there's moments that sound the oldest as well, like we are back in France or Germany in the year 1785 or something.
Well, and there's also this sense of the figure of Brazil Denard as such an important figure in American music,
Hmm.
in American singing, and really conveying a reverence for that whole tradition and what, Brazil Denard as a representative of that tradition. And again, this could be really trite, it could be really contrived, it could be really pedestrian, and it's none of those things. It just feels like a very authentic and very reverent expression of devotion to an idea, to a person, to a tradition, and to something that's perhaps inarticulable.
And we are going to talk about his U.S. military experience right after this. Classical Breakdown, your guide to classical music, is brought to you by WETA Classical. Join us for the music anytime, day or night at wetaclassical.org, where you'll also find educational resources like Take Note, the WETA Classical playlist, and our blog, Classical Score. Find all that and more at wetaclassical.org. Now we're going to talk about his brief military experience, and it's basically wrapped up all in this wonderful quote he gave in an interview. This was between 1966 and 1968, and he said this: I became a lieutenant, and I chose as far away from Vietnam as I could get. I wound up in Germany. I spent 2 years in Germany, and they would have regular drawdowns of the troops to send them over to Vietnam. But they took a look at me and knew I was not military fighting material. They asked me if I wanted to run the officers' club in Germany, and I said, of course I'll run the officers' club. I see a grand piano right over there. And I spent the next 2 years never having to wear fatigues again or combat boots or any of the other paraphernalia that go with being a combat officer. I ran the officers' club, played the piano, and wrote music and was fed too well by the chefs of the club. Talk about an experience for Hailstork that could have gone much, much differently, and he figured it out and he got through it.
You and I talked a little bit about Rossini in his early 20s, and in Milan, he was there when Napoleon had taken over
Hmm.
and narrowly avoided being drafted in 1812. And we know what happened to Napoleon in 1812 and Tchaikovsky's little overture. And that could have been Rossini,
Yeah.
but they liked his music, so they said, no, you stick around, keep writing your operas. And what a difference for history. So, I don't know why anyone would look at a young Adolphus Hailstork and say, oh, he's not combat material, but that seems to be what happened. And he was able to continue to make music and develop music. Of course, this is right after he's finished his master's degree at the Manhattan School of Music. So he's really coming into his own here in his mid-20s. At a tumultuous time in American history, and he's there in Germany, apparently living a fairly comfortable life and continuing to make music and develop musically.
Well, I'll tell you one thing. They tried to recruit us in the military in high school after 9/11, but I'll tell you something else. There was not a single recruitment effort at conservatory. Take one look at all of us in that school playing our instruments. No, they're not up to this. Okay, so we have a couple other quotes as well that talk about his experience and what also he's doing as an African American writing music in the United States. What are a couple of these short quotes we have, Evan?
He said, I was taught nothing about Black classical composers. Nothing. Nothing. There's been a very big hole, and that's what I've been interested in filling.
Hmm.
He also said, I feel a responsibility to convey through music the triumphs and tragedies of being an African American in the United States.
Those are some important quotes. I mean, one, he was taught nothing about Black classical composers. Almost no one was
Yeah,
until
you and
until
I certainly
recently.
weren't.
Hmm. And and also importantly, saying conveying through music the triumphs and tragedies of being an African American in the United States, because too much, especially as white composers writing music that is more about disaster and pain and tragedy and not triumphs, and that is what Hailstork is also doing.
Very much so.
More on where he kind of sees himself fitting in. He said, I am an African American. There exists a distinct and rich African American musical heritage that is more than pop, but has influenced worldwide popular music. That legacy, beginning with the slave songs, is an important part of me which I had overlooked in my attempt to be a classical modernist. Over the decades of my career, I have written some pieces with zero African American idioms, some other pieces strongly drawing from that rich vein, pieces with Euro American and African American styles juxtaposed, and some with both blended and varying styles. My journey to self increasingly has included music idioms of my people, the gift handed down as folk music, or church music, or jazz, or blues. And I think we hear some of that certainly, like the church music and blues with the piano quintet that we heard. But he's also saying, and I've seen him say directly, he does not want to be or is not going to be put into a box of you are just writing African American or Black music, or you are just writing European style music. He's very much sought to be himself in that regard.
And even going back to the very beginning in his 20s and, not wanting to adopt the more fashionable minimalist style and so forth. This is a composer, I think his entire life, he's really trying to find and succeeding in expressing himself in an authentic voice, which is in many ways a syncretism of a lot of different influences and styles, like any composer. In his case, we can identify what those styles are in much of the time, and yet there's a distinctiveness to his voice.
And with that, we'll get into our last piece now, which is I Will Lift Up Mine Eyes. I forget when this was composed, Evan, you'll have to remind me, but this is for chorus and orchestra, but we're going to hear it with chorus and piano. There's not a commercial recording available yet, but it really does surprisingly work on piano, like more than I usually expect when I play this type of music with choruses.
Yeah, it's hard to be sure. I think this piece was in 1989, but other sources have different years. So, as I said, I heard this piece performed at the Kennedy Center 2 years ago with the Choral Arts Society of Washington and Dr. Andre J. Thomas conducting, and quite an exciting experience to hear this live and in the full orchestral version. So I am hoping someday there'll be a commercially available recording of the full orchestra version, but even with the piano and choir version, it's quite a compelling piece. And here again, we really get a sense of Hailstork's skill as a composer for the voice and his long years of experience as a vocalist, as singing in choirs, as an organist, really understanding that idiom on a deep level, both in terms of the natural rhythms of spoken American English and being able to draw from various sources. We'll go through the piece and hear those. And also just being able to bring out the depth of meaning and feeling in the text as a composer.
And this is one that I think we'll all draw some familiarity to based on what we just heard with the symphony and with the piano quintet, and that some of the big grand sounds that he can bring up. And it sounds like this was something that goes right back to when he was young. In a quote, he said, I loved the cathedral as a kid, but when I went to the cathedral, it was to rehearsals, and so it meant something to me musically. And the grandeur of the building meant something to me because I realized 30 years ago that the acoustics of the cathedral impacted me a lot, and the sounds that can swell up in such a huge edifice impacted me. So I love creating grand moments in choral and orchestral music. This is interesting because this is an influence that goes back also like 1,000 years with music. This
Yes.
grandeur and filling this building
Yes.
with sounds that ring and ring in a particular way. And I think we hear that in his choral music, and then by extension, some of the symphonic works.
I think we can surmise that among the reasons why medieval Europeans built these cathedrals with these, soaring edifices was for the acoustics. What it would sound like to be there and to create music in a space like that. It's a very distinctive experience. And before microphones and before recording technology could have even been conceived, let alone long before they existed, to create a space where those kinds of sounds would be heard, they could only be heard in a space like that. We've all been in one of these cavernous spaces, and there's nothing like it. So Hailstork's ears are full of this as a child, as a teenager, and you really do hear the ways in which he's creating as a composer. Even in writing in chamber music, we talked about the Detroit work, and there's that sense of sonority, that sense of soaring, that sense of filling a space in a lot of this. In this cantata, "I Will Lift Up Mine Eyes," there's this tenor solo that's very prominent also, and it seems to me that the way the writing plays out evokes a number of different musical styles. There's the call and response of the black spiritual. There's the sort of the cantor and the congregation that you find in formal worship, whether in Christianity or in a synagogue. And there's an operatic, theatrical manner about it. There's a storytelling aspect about it. There's a sense of drama, and suitably so, very dramatic, very personal music, a very passionate text. But the other two works we just examined also have that quality. He's a
Mhm.
very intellectual composer, but he uses that to speak to our emotional life in a very authentic way and to express the fullness of himself faithfully.
And I think we hear a lot of that pretty clearly depicted in the first movement, "I Will Lift Up Mine Eyes." The second movement is titled "How Long," and it starts actually quite minimalist. It starts with like 15 seconds of just like one repeated note and kind of occupies a large part of the introduction. And I hear this repeated note coming back again and again, relentless in a kind of haunting way, reminds me of Ravel's Gaspar. And the chorus comes in not on a word, but they're humming. There is a whole atmosphere being built here. And then it later sounds like an interrogation. How long, how long, how long must we endure?
And there's definitely a kind of a modal quality to this writing, a kind of a chant. Like, I mean, certainly he must have known Anglican chant from his years in the Episcopal Church choir. And that repeated note you mentioned, John, is just the kind of relentless. It's like a tocsin. It's like this bell tolling, a church bell announcing a funeral or something. And this movement really showcases how Hailstork can write in a way that's accessible without pandering. It doesn't have a commercial quality. It's not trite. And the repeated note grounds the tonality in a way that's striking. It's a bit different from the intentional tonal ambiguity we find in some of the other Hailstork pieces we've been talking about. That repeated note is clearly the dominant, the fifth scale degree of a very grounded tonic, and yet we have that same quality we've talked about where the chordal structures that keep us in the tonal sphere they can wander pretty far. So these moments where a harmony sounds far outside of that tonic, it really grabs our attention and creates tension, and yet we're led back to a sense of home.
And I think it especially grabs our attention because, like in the first movement, and as he's described himself, he uses simple triadic structures, simple triads.
Yes.
And then with the voicing, he creates a richness to it. But then you get to this movement and he adds a little more coloration to it, and it sticks out and it grabs you that much more compared to the simple triadic structure. Then we have the third and final movement, "The Lord is my shepherd, alleluia." And this feels like to me just a great entry into American choral music. This feels like it kind of feels like we're walking down the road. It's like for myself, it's like me and someone else, and I'm walking with someone very important, someone who's, well respected or something. And we're walking, and more people are joining in. And it's getting kind of excited. It's very angelic sounding, and soon it's a large crowd that has been built up with this. And it feels like he does this very bolero-esque. It's very methodical. It's very, very slow. And that seems to be led by the piano, which starts with the typical choral accompaniment. Sounds like, whatever. It sounds like everything else that you'd expect with this. But then it slowly forms itself into a groove. There's this bass line that a lot of us have played 1,000 times before, and you can hear how it slowly starts to gain character. There's a little more inflection on this note, or a little more weight on this one. You can't depict it in just a few seconds, but it's this slow build-up and coloration that builds up to something so beautiful.
And I love your comparison to Bolero, which we often talk about as a 15-minute crescendo.
Yeah.
This isn't 15 minutes, but there's this long period of time where there's just building and building and building over several minutes, and it's so compelling. And again, there's that very personal, very relatable style, very sophisticated music, but also very accessible. And this movement is really powerful, it's celebratory and exalted. And I think Hailstork has a really keen sense of text setting, and you really hear that in this last movement in particular.
I read that he reads the text that he's interested in and looks at what sticks out, what gets an immediate response from him.
Yes.
And that's important as a composer. He's not trying to please this publisher, please this person, please that person. Sometimes he is. He's writing for people.
Yes.
But he's also has to come from a place that satisfies himself. And I think you hear that across the choral music, and then I think, as we heard, into the chamber music and into the big symphonic works as well, this type of choral singing or this choral style. And I mean, how many composers do we love that do this, like Mahler's symphonies or Vaughan Williams' symphonies as well?
Yeah.
So 3 works, the symphony, the piano quintet Detroit, and I Will Lift Up Mine Eyes, 3 very different works. And if you enjoyed those, there's more to listen to from Adolphus Hailstork. And perhaps we will end it, Evan, with talking about legacy, because he has a quote on this. He said, "I hope I leave a few works that'll still be done after I'm gone. I'm a historical curiosity because there aren't that many Black composers who have written symphonies, big choral pieces, and small pieces. I read once that especially the Romantics like Strauss and Mahler, they either did small pieces like songs or these mammoth symphonies. And that's how you can tell a romantic, by the way. But I want it to be more balanced than that and include chamber music and solo songs and band music. And so there's a variety out there. And if anybody wants to look back at it, then they can. I think I'll be totally forgotten for 50 years after my death, but then somebody will come along and say, hey, I discovered this stuff by this guy named Hailstork. Let's take a look at it. And then they'll say, oh, there are a few pieces worth doing again. Maybe my future Mendelssohn's down the road somewhere. I like that from Hailstork being, he said he's pragmatic, saying, probably for 50 years, no one's going to know, I even existed. But someone will probably come along and look at it and understand, the worth here.
And that quote about Mendelssohn, I think for our listeners who may not
Mm-hmm.
remember, is referring specifically to Felix Mendelssohn almost 100 years after the death of Johann Sebastian Bach, reviving interest in Bach's music. And I think a lot of composers hope, well, after I'm gone, I hope somebody will say, hey, let's look at this amazing music that's been forgotten. However, all that being said, I hope that Adolphus Hailstork, who is still alive and still composing as far as I know, like you mentioned the cantata just 3 years ago here in Washington, Knee on the Neck. I hope his music will continue to be listened to and enjoyed while he's still with us as well as after he's gone, because this is a composer whose music is really worth knowing and listening to and appreciating and celebrating.
Absolutely. And my last point on it is the hard truth is when you die, people are going to forget about you. That's life. It was, like you said, 100 years after J.S. Bach. If you said Bach, no one thought about J.S. Bach. That's not who you were thinking of. You were thinking of like CPE or Johann Christian. It was Mendelssohn who then said, hey, what's going on here? But the important thing is Bach's music was much appreciated, especially his organ playing, in his lifetime. We can't ignore what is with us right now and then appreciate it after someone dies. So that's just to say, look for living composers, listen to them now, what they're writing about right now, because that is literally for us.
Yes.
Eventually, they're going to die, and people probably won't play their music that much. But then eventually, it'll come back. But it's bitter when it comes back, knowing no one enjoyed it before, like some of the other composers we've seen and talked about. So listen to living composers, and we'll put a playlist on the show notes page at classicalbreakdown.org. Thanks for listening to Classical Breakdown, your guide to classical music. For more information on this episode, visit the show notes page at classicalbreakdown.org. You can send me comments and episode ideas to classicalbreakdown@weta.org. And if you enjoy this episode, leave a review in your podcast app. I'm John Banther. Thanks for listening to Classical Breakdown from WETA Classical.